The history of 1970s Australian motoring has a list of stars. This isn't that list. 10 cars from the decade that deserved more than they got, counting down from 10 to 1. The one at the very top was built specifically for Australian roads, outperformed the domestic benchmark in contemporary tests, and has since been almost completely erased from the record. That one is still coming. Number 10. Datsun 180B Bluebird, 1972 to 1977. The 180B had a 1.8-litre four-cylinder and sat in the middle of the Datsun range, above the economy 120Y, a considerable distance from the 240Z, competing directly against the Ford Cortina TD and the smaller domestics for the family buyer who needed more than a city runabout, but didn't want a full-size Kingswood. It was mid-size and honest about it. Families who chose it got solid service across the years without drama or complaint. The problem was that the Datsun story in Australia was being told at the two ends of the range, the 120Y rewriting expectations at the bottom, the 240Z rewriting expectations at the top, and the 180B held the middle, without claiming any of the narrative. The record of what was available in Australian showrooms in the early 1970s moves past it without pausing. The next car earned even less goodwill from the people who chose it. Number 9. Morris Marina, 1972 to 1975. British Leyland assembled the Marina at Zetland in Sydney, priced it at the lower end of the family segment, and aimed it at buyers who might otherwise have considered the Holden Gemini or the Ford Cortina. The 1.8-litre four-cylinder was the standard fitment. The proportions were reasonable, and the price was competitive, and on paper the Marina had a case. In practice, the build quality coming off the Zetland line was inconsistent enough that buyers who compared it with equivalent Japanese alternatives at similar prices didn't find the comparison difficult. The reputation traveled the way these things always travel, from one owner to the next, one conversation at the service station to another, until the Marina had established a standing in Australian motoring that no improvement to the specification was going to reverse. When production ended, the market moved on without a backward glance. Forgetting the Marina was less an oversight than a collective decision. The next car was forgotten for the opposite reason, because everything about it was right. Number 8. Toyota Corona, 1971 to 1979. There are cars forgotten because something went wrong. The Toyota Corona is forgotten because nothing went wrong at all. A four-cylinder family sedan through successive series across the decade, growing from 1.6 to 1.8 litres, priced in the mainstream segment, reliable in the way Toyota had already established as its identifying trait in the Australian market. The Corona competed against the Datsun 180B, the Ford Cortina TD, and the lower tier of the domestic range, and held its ground in any comparison a careful buyer might draw. Families who chose one got a car that started every morning and returned exactly what the service schedule asked for, year after year. The difficulty of being remembered for that kind of performance is that it generates no story, no collapse, no famous variant, no single moment that the decade latched onto. The Corona was there throughout the 1970s, and then the account of the decade moved forward without noting it had been. The car just ahead was noticed the moment it arrived, for a reason that had nothing to do with anything else in any other showroom. Number 7. Subaru Leone, 1974 to 1979. Subaru came to Australia with a flat-4 engine, cylinders laid horizontally in opposing pairs on either side of the crankshaft, a configuration that produced a sound and a running character unlike anything the domestic manufacturers or the established Japanese brands were fitting. The Leone sedan and wagon were conventional enough in shape and intent, a practical family car at a sensible price, competing in the same general space as the smaller Japanese alternatives. The engine was the thing that required explanation, and mechanical differences that require explanation before a buyer can appreciate them are the hardest kind to sell from a showroom floor. Subaru's Australian presence grew over the following decades until the brand became one of the most recognized in the country. These first years, when the name was unknown and the flat 4 needed a demonstration, rather than a reputation to speak for it, are the part of that larger story the standard account of Australian motoring leaves out entirely. The next car had a name that almost every Australian already knew, and still managed to be the entry the histories skip. Number 6. Holden Statesman HX Deville, 1976 to 1977. The Statesman Deville line ran through the HQ platform, the HX platform, and the HZ platform, each offering a stretched wheelbase, the 308 cubic inch V8, and rear passenger accommodation that no standard Kingswood configuration could approach. The HQ introduced the concept and receives the attention that comes with being first. The HZ closed the Kingswood era and receives the attention that comes with being last. The HX ran through 1976 and 1977 between them, carrying the same V8 and the same extended rear cabin, with no less quality and no less purpose, without being the start or the end of anything. Holden enthusiasts who work through the Statesman lineage carefully know the HX Deville. The broader account of prestige Australian motoring in the 1970s tends to move from the HQ to the HZ, without pausing on what sat between them. That is the particular form of forgetting the HX Deville has experienced. Not absence from the market, but absence from the sentence. We are halfway through. From here, the cars on this list were making more serious arguments, arriving with engineering the Australian market wasn't ready to reward, or building reputations that the larger companies around them never allowed to settle. The car at number 1 made the most complete argument of all. That one is still coming. Number 5, Volvo 145, 1969 to 1974 in Australia. In 1959, Volvo fitted the 3-point seatbelt to its cars and immediately made the patent freely available to any manufacturer that wanted it. No fee, no conditions. By the time the 145 estate was on Australian roads in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Volvo had been treating structural safety as a design principle for over a decade, building bodies intended to absorb impact rather than transmit it. The 145 used a 2.0-litre four-cylinder, a rear-wheel drive layout, and a wagon body that gave a family genuine carrying capacity alongside the structural engineering Volvo had been refining in Sweden. The Australian buyer who chose a 145 over a Kingswood wagon in 1971 was making a decision most people around them couldn't easily evaluate, because the mainstream conversation about passive safety as a reason to choose a particular car hadn't started yet in Australia. Volvo's argument was correct. It was also about a decade ahead of the Australian market's readiness to hear it. Getting credit for being right that early is, as usual, unlikely. The next car was making a different kind of early argument. Number 4, Honda Accord, from 1977. Honda's Australian presence before the Accord arrived was small but established. The Civic had been here long enough to prove the brand's economy credentials to the specific type of buyer paying close attention. The Accord was Honda's move toward the mainstream family segment. More cabin space, more refinement, a four-cylinder positioned against established Japanese rivals at comparable pricing, rather than against the smallest available option. Honda's dealer network in Australia in 1977 was modest, and the brand name carried none of the weight in the family segment that Datsun or Toyota had been accumulating across the decade. The buyer who chose an early Accord was making a decision based on what the car was, rather than on what the name meant, because in that segment, the name didn't yet mean anything in particular. The Accord eventually became one of the most familiar cars in Australia. These first sales, which happened before any of that recognition had been established, are the part of Honda's Australian story the larger history tends to skip. The next car had been in Australia for over a decade and still left almost no trace. Number 3. Renault 16, 1967 to 1978. In Australia. Here is what the Renault 16 was. Launched in France in 1965, a large tailgate opening at the rear, a fold-down rear seat creating a flat cargo floor, front-wheel drive, and independent suspension at all four corners. It was named European Car of the Year not long after its launch. What it had designed before the format had a name was the practical family hatchback, the layout that every Japanese small family car of the 1980s would use, and that the Australian mainstream would eventually arrive at through the Commodore hatchback and the wave of practical family cars that followed. Australian buyers who found the Renault 16 through the brand's modest local dealer network in the late 1960s and through the 1970s were sitting in a car that described the future of family motoring more accurately than anything being offered alongside it. Renault sold the 16 in Australia for over a decade. The buyers who found it made an informed and early choice. There simply weren't enough of them for the 16 to write itself into the record of what 1970s Australia drove. The car just ahead came from the same parent company as the Tasman and the P76, and its story ends in the same place. Number 2. Leyland Mini, to 1978. Most people who know the Mini know the British version, Alec Issigonis's 1959 design, the car from Longbridge, the cultural object that defined a generation of British motoring. Far fewer know that the Mini was assembled in Australia by BMC Australia and later British Leyland Australia at Zetland in Sydney for close to 2 decades. Through most of that time, it was sold as the Austin Mini or the Morris Mini. In its final years, as the brand consolidated under the Leyland name, it was the Leyland Mini. When British Leyland's withdrawal from Australian manufacturing ended the Zetland line in 1978, a specifically Australian chapter of the Mini's history closed that almost no buyer knew had been running. The people who purchased Australian-assembled Minis through the 1970s were in most cases buying a car they thought of as an import. The fact that it had been built locally by Australian workers across nearly 20 years of production was not part of the way the car was marketed or understood. That chapter ended in 1978 with no ceremony and no acknowledgement. The car at number 1 came from the same company, was built at the same plant, and has been even more completely erased. Number 1. Austin Kimberley, 1970 to 1973. The Austin Kimberley was not assembled in Australia from British components. It was designed in Australia at the Zetland plant in Sydney by engineers whose brief was to produce a full-size family car for the specific demands of Australian roads, and to do it with engineering that went further than what Holden and Ford were offering. The engine that resulted was a 2.2-litre overhead cam 6-cylinder. The Holden and Ford 6s competing against it operated their valves through pushrod systems driven by camshafts mounted low in the block, effective, proven, and well understood. The Kimberley moved the camshaft to the cylinder head directly above the valves, eliminating the pushrods entirely and reducing the mechanical complexity between the camshaft and the valves it was controlling. The result was more precise valve timing, better engine breathing across a wider RPM range, and a design architecture more technically advanced than what the domestic manufacturers were building. The car competed against the HQ Kingswood and the XA Falcon at comparable pricing. The contemporary motoring press tested it alongside both and found it a genuine competitor, not almost serious, but actually serious. British Leyland's global financial collapse reached Zetland, and the Kimberley went out of production in 1973 with almost nothing accumulated in terms of public recognition. The P76 arrived and took most of the attention the Leyland story generated. The Tasman, the companion 4-cylinder model, received what remained. The Kimberley, which had the most advanced engine of anything British Leyland Australia produced, and which was designed for this country from first principles, received almost none of it. Most people who follow 1970s Australian motoring seriously do not know its name. The ones who do tend to come back to the same observation. The gap between what the Kimberley was and what it is remembered as is one of the wider ones the decade left behind, and it has never been properly settled. These weren't minor projects. They were genuine attempts, from manufacturers learning what Australian buyers needed, from European engineers bringing ideas the local market wasn't ready for, and from British Leyland writing the same story of decline across several different model lines while producing something worth remembering in between. The standard account of 1970s Australian motoring is shorter than the decade deserves. These 10 are part of what the shorter version quietly leaves out. Is there a 1970s car you remember that never comes up in these conversations? Something from a driveway nearby, a relative's car, something you've seen once and never heard mentioned since? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and if Australian motoring history is what brought you here, a like and a subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome keeps it going.